everyone, my name is Mattias Lanas and I'm a science illustrator and artist. In this video, I'm going to be looking at artist explorer Tony Foster's artwork titled Parinacota Looking Due North Across Lago Chungara, 5 days at 15,400 feet, that he did in 2015, and that is one element in his larger journey of artworks called Exploring Beauty, Watercolor Diaries from the Wild. I'll be using this as a springboard to focus on a specific watercolor subject. If you're unfamiliar with Tony Foster and his work, or with the Foster Museum based in Palo Alto, California, or if you'd just like more information about watercolor journeys in general, be sure to visit our website at www.thefoster.org. Now, let's take a look back at the artwork. It so happens that I traveled with Tony Foster on this trip in northern Chile where he painted Parinacota volcano, which means that I'm in the unique position to be able to speak from experience. I can say that the painting really does capture the unusual and awe-inspiring landscape well. It really was that awesome. Parinacota volcano, as a destination for the Exploring Beauty journey, was nominated by one of Tony Foster's luminaries, a volcanologist named Sir Stephen Sparks of the University of Bristol. Sparks specifically thought that the view from across Chungara Lake was perhaps one of the most beautiful views of a volcano in the entire world. While I was on the trip with Tony Foster in northern Chile, we spent about 5 days in the area around the volcano, where Tony managed to paint about half of the landscape on his large format watercolor paper. The rest of the painting he finished in his home studio back in Cornwall, England. There were also tons of really charismatic wildlife, like these chinchilla-like rodents called vizcachas, these llamas, and abundant waterfowl in Chungara Lake. In his artwork, Foster includes studies of 2 of the Chilean flamingo feathers in the lower right as part of multiple souvenir elements that underline his landscape painting, and today it's on these that I'd like to focus our attention. My thinking is that it's better to start with a small and more manageable subject, like a feather as compared to, say, a whole mountain, and then work up to other subjects in subsequent video demonstrations. Alright, so to start, let's engage closely and briefly with these watercolored feathers. One quality of Tony Foster's watercolors that I really appreciate is his ability to capture a lot of detail without overworking the subject. These 2 reddish feathers that he's painted look deceptively simple, but there's a ton of patience and careful brushwork at play in creating them. I love the gentle color gradient we see from left to right, going from a lighter red to a deeper red. Also, Foster's captured the different textures of the feather really well, from the feeling of a hard, hollow quill on the left, followed by soft, downy barbs that we see at the base of the feathers, and then lastly the tousled, more rigid barbs that form the bulk of the feather shape. So now I'm transitioning over to the table where I'll be working. I'm going to be practicing a couple different ways of approaching painting feathers today. If you'd like to follow along and practice painting feathers with me, gather some basic supplies, including the following. You'll need a reference feather to paint with, so I was lucky and found this blue jay feather. This is native to the United States, and you can see it has that vivid blue in it. I really like this and think it will be a good subject to work from because of the vivid blue and also because of the pattern that the feather has on it. So this will be a really nice reference. If you're a beginner to watercolor, I suggest that you find a feather that is not completely white. It's just harder to render something white with a white background like on this paper that we're using. So try to shoot for anything that's a color other than white. You'll also need a pencil. Any ordinary one will do. With the pencil, you'll use an eraser as well. I have a kneaded eraser that I'm using. You'll need watercolor brushes, and I'll be using 2 today. Both are a Winsor Newton Series 7 brush. So this first one is a size 6, and the second one is a size 000. I like to use the size 6. It's kind of an all-purpose brush for me, and it's really nice because it can carry a lot of water, it can carry a lot of pigment in the natural hair fiber, but also it has such a fine point that I can use that to do a lot of my detail work after the fact, and I don't have to be transitioning between too many brushes. Sometimes, however, I want to go even finer, and so I'll use the 000 brush to get that level of intense detail. But any natural fiber brush in general should be a good starting brush for watercolor, and it's always nice to have an assortment if you can afford that. We'll need watercolor paints, of course, and so I have a palette prepared here with a bunch of paints. I'm using Winsor Newton brand, which is the same brand of watercolors that Tony Foster uses, and I have an assortment here. For this workshop, I'd recommend that you have just at least the primary colors. It doesn't really matter what brand. The more professional, the easier it might be to achieve really intense, vivid colors, but work with what you have on hand. So I'm gonna go over the colors in here. I'll also post the description of names for each of these colors in the video description below, so you can reference it later if you'd like. But really quick, here we have raw umber, this kind of brown one here. We have Hooker's green, Viridian, French ultramarine, cerulean blue, permanent rose, alizarin crimson, Indian red, burnt sienna, and then for yellows I'm using a Winsor Yellow, a yellow ochre, and a cadmium yellow. And again, this is a general palette. This is one that I like to use in the field and in the studio as well. I'm not going to use all of the colors today, but even just having an assortment of the primaries is enough. You'll notice as well that this palette has a lot of the mixing space used up. I like to leave my previous mixes on until it becomes overwhelming and I need to start clean and fresh. But a lot of times I'll reuse these same colors. It is helpful, however, to have extra mixing space. And for those that know Tony Foster, you'll remember that he uses a Tupperware lid for his mixing space, which is a clever way of repurposing a cheap kitchen item into something that's pretty valuable for watercolors. In today's workshop, I'm going to be using an extra mixing palette that I have to create my color mixes and then test those on the paper here. Anything works as long as you have that extra space. You'll also need some sort of absorbent materials to wipe off your brush while you're mixing colors and between colors. Some professional watercolor painters will use a natural sponge like this one here. I'm going to be using, and I generally prefer to use, an absorbent paper towel. You can see this one's been used a bunch already, and it will continue to work until it's pretty blotted out with color. And I also wanted to show that I sometimes will use a repurposed sock that's been sewn into this cuff, because the inside lining of this sock is very absorbent, sort of like a towel. I can just quickly dab my brush onto it and wipe off the color and then pick something off. I find it pretty convenient just to have it on my wrist like that so I don't have to go looking for my paper towel. Finally, since we are working in watercolor, you'll need water. So here I have a glass. Gather all your materials and then join me. Okay, so to begin, I'm going to clear off this space. We're going to place our reference feather somewhere where we can observe it well. Position it in the angle that we want to draw it from. I'm going to draw this a little bit larger than life so that it's clear for you to see. If you're working with a bigger feather, of course you can draw it to any size you want, but I would recommend erring on a fairly large size just so that you're not limited by the brush width when you're trying to get your detail work in. So let's see. We're going to start by doing the drawing, and the drawing is pretty essential to any watercolor painting you're going to do. Drawing is the foundation. It sets the foundation for the painting afterwards. So if you don't have a well-rendered drawing, you'll have a much harder time with the watercolor. So for this feather, I'm going to start by an obvious shape, which is the quill, the shaft here. I'm going to try to mimic that angle and that curvature. And it's okay if it's not exact. I am trying to be as careful as possible in observing my feather and trusting my eye with what I see rather than painting what I think I see. Oftentimes our brain will try to impose itself and say, that's not what a feather looks like. And when that happens, a lot of times the result is something that doesn't look as accurate as the subject that we're trying to paint. So I'm really just trying to use my eyes here and leave my brain out of the equation as much as possible. But here's a basic midrib, and hopefully you can see this in the video. I know it's pretty light. All right, And now I'm going to work along the outside edge, the outside contour of this feather, and try to create the same general form. I'll start on one side and just sort of gauge the width between this mid shaft and the exterior, and I can gauge that a little bit visually where this line should go. Again, hopefully you can see this in the video. I know it's pretty light, but it has to be light, otherwise my pencil mark is going to be way too dark when I put the watercolor over. Let's start over here. So I have kind of a broken up feather at the base. And then this side flares out a lot more. I have lots of little imperfections in the feather that I want to capitalize on because those will give a more natural, authentic look to the feather, catching those little imperfections. So let's see if we can get those in, all these little divots and grooves and things. And I realize now that my midrib is a little too curved, so I'm going to adjust it slightly, and good thing I have my eraser for that. But as you draw, you begin to study your subject, and that's pretty key. A big part of the process of painting and drawing for me is being able to learn something new about my subject. And so for me, it's a way of educating myself about the natural world. That's why I love doing science illustration so much. I think of drawing and painting as a tool to teach me about what I'm observing, and I glean much more information this way than if I were just taking a photograph of it. All right. So once you've blocked in the major shapes for your feather, you're good to start, but I'm going to make sure that this is nice and accurate as far as I'd like it to be, so that I've done a lot of the legwork now, and the watercolor can just fill in these forms that I've created. All right, so that looks pretty good. From my angle, it looks pretty good. I'm slightly skewed to the side, whereas in this video, you'll be looking at it top down. Okay, so now I'm going to add just a couple more of the little details down here. It doesn't have to be exact. These are the more of the down feathers, but I want to get a sense for where they are so I can place them later. And I'm going to also refine the bottom portion of the quill just to match what I'm seeing a little bit. All right. Now, a couple of other things that I want to block in, and I hope you can see these in the video. I know this feather's a bit small, are the different marks. So I have these bands running along the left side of the feather. I'm going to try to slot those in so that I have a sense of where they are, and I can just drop in the watercolor later. So roughly like this. These black bands, this beautiful pattern that it's creating in the feather that will make a really interesting and fun watercolor project. And then not only that, but it has this white tip that I don't know if you can see, that I'm gonna make sure to isolate so that I don't accidentally color that in. Remember, with watercolor, it's a transparent medium. You're working on white paper, and anytime you want to keep white or light colors, it just means you have to preserve that natural lightness from the paper, meaning you're not painting on those areas. So you kind of have to think in reverse a little bit, and plan ahead so that you don't accidentally darken an area that you wanted to keep light. Okay, and these bands, it looks like a couple of them run over to the right side as well, so I'll just give a little indication of where those are as well. Last but not least, with my pencil, I'm going to highlight a couple of the imperfections in the feather that convey a directionality to each of these barbs. So the barbs are the little linear elements that run along both sides of the feather. And I see some that are a little bit more prominent than others. I'm going to give a couple of indications of where these are. And that's going to be a helpful visual guide for when I go to put in some details later. All right, so there we go. I'm done sort of blocking in my feather. I can put my pencil away for now. And now I'm going to get my paintbrush. Let's get some water. I like to start by pre-wetting my watercolors, especially if they are dry. And that just helps me get them back into solution when I want to mix them up. It's a lot faster this way. All right, dry my brush off on my paper towel. And so there's two approaches to creating this feather. The first one I'm going to do is starting with a wash, which is just kind of a preliminary glaze, a preliminary layer on this feather, and I'm slowly going to build up colors over time and intensity over time by adding other glazes, other layers on top of that. So that's one approach. I'll do a second feather afterwards with a different approach that's more direct, where I'm just adding the color in, dropping it in where I'd like it to be, and doing more of a dry approach, a bit closer to what Tony Foster does. But I like for this feather to do the wet and wet technique first, because it feels to me like there's a lot of smooth tones going on in the feather, and watercolor is pretty good at doing that on its own, especially when you're using wet and wet. The pigment just flows through the wet areas. So I'll start out actually by just getting a damp brush and pre-wetting the areas that I want to cover with pigment. In this case, that's the whole feather body. So you probably can't see in the video very well, but what I'm doing is adding a little bit of water to all of the form of the feather. And if I look from the side, especially with this light, I can see where the sheen is. I can see the water's reflecting the light, and so I can tell where I'm placing the water. If you have trouble with this, though, you're welcome to tint the water just a little bit with any color, just a tiny bit, enough so that you can see it, but that it won't do sort of a lasting stain on your piece. Any light color should do. Okay, so now I've added my water to this, and before this dries, I'll need to act quickly. I'm going to mix up some of my colors to get on here, and this dark here is some might call it a black. I like to think of it as a mix of just dark colors that I have. So I'm going to use this burnt sienna, and let's get my mixing space out. Little burnt sienna. And I'm going to mix that with some of my French Ultramarine. That brown and that blue kind of make a nice dark color that I can do a little test swatch with. Let's see next to the feather. And that seems pretty close. So I'm going to start with that and just start dropping this color in. You can see how the pigment just fades in this beautiful watery way. And I'm going to put it mostly on this side over here where I see the dark color going, avoiding more of the blue on the left. Although that blue is pretty dark and it could use some of this as well. So let's see, we'll get some in there. This is a pretty light color that I'm putting on, and it will dry even lighter, so there's no harm in me applying this so liberally right now. All right, and now I'm going to get a little bit of French Ultramarine. Mix it with some of my brown, a little bit of the burnt sienna again, but keep more of the blue this time. Let's do a test. That's still a little too brown. Let's get some blue. Let's do another test. That's looking pretty good, and we'll drop that in along where I'm seeing this blue, primarily on the left side. And the blue will also work pretty well to darken the feather. You can see the pigment just runs wherever I placed the water previously. And then as it dries, it'll become more crisp. So I'm glad I got this pigment in while it was nice and wet, so it smooths out very evenly. Okay, so now I'm going to wait for this to dry a little bit. Once it's dry, I'll start to drop in some other colors, and I'll be right back. Okay, so now this feather has mostly dried. If I feel the paper, I can see that it's still a little damp. That's actually a nice spot to be in, where it's not wet, but you can still feel some of the humidity, because that will allow me to do some of the detail work while it not being super crisp. And I want to take advantage of that. This feather is very smooth, and we see a lot of gradients in color going on, and so I can use that to my advantage at this state here. So I'm going to grab a little bit more of the burnt sienna that I was working with, and again mix it with French Ultramarine to keep up that nice dark almost black color that we have going on. And I'm going to use this now and just darken this side of the feather. Apply another layer, and you can see that where I'm applying the brush is a bit more defined, but the pigment is still kind of rippling out a little bit. And I'll go all the way to my edge. I'm starting to lose some of my pencil marks now, but that's okay, because we actually want them to fade a little bit. And I'll make sure to come right up to the edge and start defining or redefining my edge of the feather. And I'm going to take advantage now of this layer of glaze and start to reinforce some of the barb directions that we have in the feather, doing it a little bit haphazardly, so as not to be too consistent, not too uniform. That tends to look a little bit unnatural, and so having something that's a bit broken up and chaotic. Oops. Well, you can see what happens sometimes when you're trying to do a video and watercolor paint at the same time. You make little mistakes, but that's okay. This is a test piece, and so I get to leave that mistake there as a record of trying to move too quickly with this video. All right, so adding this other layer in, refining a bit wherever my edges are. I'm also going to place a little bit on the other side where I see the feather is darkest up here, and just sort of start to block in these shapes. I'm also going to leave a bit of a gap this time along that shaft midline, just a little bit of a broken gap so that I can help to redefine where that area is and reinforce some of these barb lines. It's also not a bad time to start reinforcing the bands that are on the left side. You can sort of drop them in as blobs right now, loosely following the guidelines that you drew for yourself with the pencil. All right. So this is a pretty early glazing, a pretty early base layer. You can tell that the actual feather is much darker and has more details than what I've accomplished right now. But this is a good starting point, and from here I'm just going to build up layers, which is called glazing. And as I do that, I'm going to build up richness and intensity and detail. So I'll be able to capture all of that. Okay, so I got to let this dry a little bit. Okay, so we're back. This is completely dry now, which is great. It means I can add other layers on top of this without muddying up the pigments underneath, and also build up more of the intensity that we see in the feather, more of the darkness and intensity. So I'm gonna go back to my paint, mix up my same combination, which seems to be really successful thus far, and start to do some glazing. So we have the burnt sienna, and mixing colors is an art form in and of itself. Getting to understand a bit of color theory, and how to create darkness, how to create nice, rich, vivid colors, could be a class in and of itself. But for now, we're just gonna I'm just gonna mix colors that seem right to me based on the subject. All right, so there we go. We're building up our blacks again. It's important, as always, to do test swatches to gauge both intensity and color accuracy. All right, and it looks like this is a decent color. So here we go. Now I'm gonna really try to emphasize again that mid-rib, because it's pretty delineated in the subject, in the reference. And so by painting right up against it this way, I can help it to stand out. All right, so I'm being a bit more careful now. And once again, giving a couple of indications of these barbs, the directionality of these barbs, wherever I see some prominent examples. You can see with just a little bit of pressure, with using just the tip of the paintbrush, I can really get a lot of detail, even with a thick brush like this. That's why I like these Winsor and Newton brushes. Let's add a little bit to the other side. Again, kind of leaving the mid-rib as is, but going up right against the edge using a really fine line with the tip of my brush. There we go. And it pays to be patient, it pays to be nice and light with your touch, because now is when the detail starts becoming more important. I'm gonna darken my color, so get a little bit more of the same combination, which has been so successful. I might err a little bit more, or veer a little bit more towards the blue now, so add more of the French Ultramarine rather than the burnt sienna, just because that'll make it look darker. That blue is so dark and intense. And while this is nice and wet still, I'll just add another layer. I should say damp, it's not wet, it's damp. So I have a little bit more control than before where it just flowed everywhere. And I'm trying to emphasize now a bit more of that color gradient. So I have a pretty dark mark there. I'm gonna pat off my brush, rinse it out just a little bit and make it dry, a little bit on the moist side, but clean of pigment, and that way I can blur that edge just a tiny bit so that it's not so sharp, just like that. So I'm patting it off in between so that it's not really applying, it's not adding color, it's more lifting off color. And then this is important. If I get a nice dry brush at this point, I can start to pull a little bit of pigment away from certain areas where I want to add some highlights. And so this is helpful in adding in some of those imperfections we were talking about earlier. Using the tip of the brush, just create some lighter areas that maybe fade into dark ones. And your brush has to be fairly dry to do this. I think of it sort of like mopping up some color. So as I mop, I'll dry in between, make a nice point with my brush. Mixed success on this one. A lot of it depends on getting the moisture content just right, but I've got some sort of texture going on here which I like, and that'll help to emphasize the natural feel of this feather. Okay, take a little bit more of my pigment. I'm going to dilute it just a little bit, and I'm going to work on the bottom of the feather here, which is darker in the reference photo than it is right now, but I don't want to make it as dark as this. I want to keep that gradient going from light to dark, so I'm going to dilute the pigment that I have mixed up just a little bit so that I can apply it here now. And again, right along the mid-rib, I'm going to glaze with this layer. There we go. This time, instead of going up to the edge, since down here it sort of ruffles a little bit, and we have those more downy feather barbs, I'm going to start to add in some of those and make the edge of the feather less defined, a little bit more wispy and organic. There we go. All right, and now the other side, same thing, using that diluted mix. We're going to start to define this other side at the bottom. And I'm going to fuzz this one out using that directionality as well, keeping it in line with the direction of the barbs. And I don't want to do too much in here because this, to me, is a different color. This changes to blue over here. So let's work on that. I'm going to clean off my brush, use my handy sock. And now we're going to take some Ultramarine over here. This is the French Ultramarine. I'm going to mix it with a little bit of Cerulean Blue, which is a nice lighter blue. And we're going to do a test before I put this on. But yeah, that looks pretty good. Let's see. So there's that blue again. That looks pretty good to me, at least for a base layer. So we're going to liberally apply this now, and it has a really crisp, defined edge. So I'm going to work with that. Oh, and this is so satisfying to just create this really crisp, defined edge. And then the rest of it I can just color in. And I'm going to go right up to the mid-rib, same as I did on the right side, to help define that form. Look at that blue. It stands out so much against the dark, against the black. And then before this dries, same as before, I want to fade it out a little bit. So I'm going to wipe off my brush with some water, dry it a little bit so that it's sort of a moist brush, and then kind of fuzz out that sharp edge and get it to fade into more of a gradient and push it down along this way. And then the same up here, just kind of fade that edge so it's not so sharp and defined. There we go. All right. So the colors are coming alive. The feather is still a lot darker than what I got going here, but patience is really important in watercolors. You got to slowly build up your layers, especially as you're working with glazing like this, in order to achieve a more intense result. And I know a lot of people, when they're starting out with watercolors, get frustrated by this. They feel like they can't achieve the depth, the intensity of color that they're looking for. Part of that has to do with the pigments you're using and with the types of paints. More professional grade will allow you to get more intense, rich colors, but also a lot of it has to do with patience and slowly building up colors over time. Unlike opaque materials like oils or acrylics, where you can just mix up the color you want, see the intensity in on the palette, and then apply it to your canvas or paper. With watercolors, you'll mix up a color and you'll be surprised when you put it down on the paper that it's not the same rich intensity that you had that it looked like you were mixing up. And so you need to build up layers over time. All right, so this is looking good. Let's get a little bit more of these darks. We're gonna do an ultramarine again with burnt sienna, but this time, once again, err on the side of blue to achieve more of a bluey black color. Let's do a test. I'm gonna say a little bit more blue. Let's do a test. That's looking pretty good. So that we're now going to apply at the top of the feather, all along the top. And I think I'm going to do it on both sides, because I start to see it bleeding over into the other side here. All right, same thing as before. Gonna wipe off my brush, keep it nice and damp but clean, and then do a little bit of detail and cleanup work, fuzzing sharp edges, getting a little bit more blending going on. Trying to match that gradient that I'm seeing, that I'm encountering. All right. That looks pretty good. Let's do a little bit more of that. And I think I'm going to dilute it because it's pretty rich and intense. But I'll do it a little bit more slowly. And I'm going to do some more down here. The more I look at this, the more I see a little bit of kind of a violet in there. I'm going to see if I can mix some permanent rose in with this, or Alizarin Crimson actually will do. See how that works. So let's try some Alizarin Crimson with French Ultramarine. Get kind of a violet color. Yeah, just a little bit. Test that intensity. Pretty light, which is good. And then I'm gonna just do a little bit of that where I feel like I'm seeing some of that violet pop. Once again, do my move with a cleaner brush, fuzz an edge, make a nice gradient. All right, and now while I let this dry here, I'm going to work on this white part at the top. There's not too much I want to do there. It's a pretty light area, and so it almost matches the color of the paper and the tone of the paper, but I still want to define it a little bit so that it doesn't look unintentional in the painting. So I might emphasize it just a little more than I'm seeing it in the actual reference. I'll go ahead and grab a light blue, kind of some of the mixture that we were working with earlier, but just make sure it's pretty light and diluted. and keep a fairly dry brush just so that I can have a sharper point and more definition, and then kind of outline where I'm seeing the edge of this white shape, and then accentuate the mid-rib with this color. And again, it's maybe not quite like I'm seeing it, but I want to define this so that it looks really intentional and it's understood that it's part of the feather. All right, good enough. And now let's work on this part down here, which is a little bit more dry. So I'm gonna get the quill part to pop a little bit more. Same thing, I'm gonna grab some of the same color I've been working with, this sort of black that I've created by mixing the blue and brown. And a sharp point again, I'm just gonna add a bit of a shadow to where I'm seeing the cast shadow here on this reference right along the edge of the quill. This has to be pretty controlled and light. Oops, I blew the reference over. Let's put that back. There we go. All right. So the quill, you can see, starts out pretty light down here. It's almost white, and then around this part where the feather barbs start coming out, it turns pretty dark, and then it runs pretty dark all the way along the feather. But it also has a nice reflection that I can see. I'm not sure if you see it in the video, somewhere along the middle. So I'm going to leave some of that white in there, but I'm going to go ahead and mix up a pretty dark black using the same combination that I've been using this whole time. A little bit more intense than the other ones, and this will be for when this is absolutely dry. I can apply this and create a really rich, intense mid-rib. So a bunch of blue, and then grab my burnt sienna, mix that in, and do a quick test. That looks pretty good. I might build up the intensity just a little bit since that is pretty rich black. Get some more blue. And then a little more burnt sienna. All right, there we go. So we'll let that sit for now until this is completely dry. But this is getting pretty close to finished. One thing that I can do now is work on these bands once again. So I defined them once. Now I'm going to go over them once more. And actually I can use part of this mix I just made. I'm just going to dilute it with a little bit of water, and using the tip of the brush, actually I'm going to switch over now, use this smaller brush, the 000, so I can get a bit more control. I'm going to grab this mixture that we were creating, and then paying attention to the specific shapes of each of these bands, I'm going to try to go in a little more carefully now. One band, two band, and here again I want to really observe and pay attention to what is going on with these bands, because they're pretty prominent, and they will go a long way towards generating a feeling of natural order, creating a good sense of kind of the organic nature of this feather. If I do something that's too consistent, too uniform, the bands are super even and super perfectly spaced out and that kind of thing, it'll start to look a little trite, a little fake, like you weren't really looking at your subject. And I noticed that the bottom edge of these bands is a little more clean than the top edge. The top edge is a bit more diffuse. This one gets lost a little bit in the reference, which is good because it's getting lost a little bit in the painting as well. All right, check my thicknesses. This one looks a little thicker to me. And good. And let's see, it looks like the rest is almost ready to, it's almost dry enough. I'll start adding a bit more details in here while I wait for that final bit to dry, using my very fine brush. All these little details, all these imperfections go such a long way towards making this feel more authentic, more real. And it can be scary sometimes to add, you know, when you're at this stage, adding the darker areas and the more intense areas. But this is where the magic happens. This is where it really starts kind of coming alive and feeling 3D and feeling more finished. I forgot these two bands continue on this side, so I'll add a little bit of that. Okay, blew my feather over again. So now we're gonna work on that mid-rib. Let's get the black that we mixed up. I'm gonna use, again, this really tiny brush that I have, or you can be really careful and use the tip of your thick brush. And now I'm just gonna focus on the parts of the feather that are nice and dark, and carefully delineate those. With this really rich black that we mixed up. This is so cool. That just about does it. And I see one more area that I feel like could be more accurate. I'm a lifelong learner, so I'm always, you know, studying a subject, and if I'm painting it, I'm learning as I go. And some of it's trial and error, and it will come out more accurately sometimes than others, but that's part of the fun of it. So let's see here. This looks like it doesn't need as much texture in there, so let's get a little bit of the burnt sienna and just add a bit more of a glaze. All right. Last but not least, finishing touches are, I want to add a little bit of this, you probably can't see the detail from the video, but just the directions of the barbs that are splaying out in either direction on each side. And I'm going to do that with that really fine brush again, using the very tip, and then choose some areas close to the mid-rib with this dark that we mixed up. Start to add in just the hint of that texture, especially coming from the mid-rib. And then same thing on the other side, and maybe use the Ultramarine blue. gives us a bit more of a sense of 3D-ness as well. All right, and I think I'm gonna call it at this point. You know, you can continue to futz with it as much as you like, being careful not to overwork, but at some point you just gotta call it done. So this is one way to approach a feather, kind of building up these layers, and thinking of doing a lot of your wet work in the beginning and then working dry over as you get more and more finished and adding in fine details. I'm also going to quickly walk through a different way that I might approach doing this, and in fact I did some tests earlier and I almost prefer the second version, which is it's a bit more of a direct approach. So instead of building up those layers with a wet technique first and then drier layers later, I'm just kind of adding blobs of color, and worrying less about the overall accuracy of the smoothness of the feather, and just trying to get a more of a sense of the general shapes going on in the feather. So it's kind of a bit more abstract, but it creates a really nice effect. And so to do that, I'm going to quickly draw another feather. All right, so I've got my drawing for the second one, roughly equivalent. And this time, instead of doing a wet, instead of wetting the entire surface of the feather first, what I'm gonna do is just mix up my color. And I'll grab the color that I previously mixed. Let's do a quick test. It's good enough for now. It's nice and light. Still wanna work light to dark. It's kind of the general rule with watercolors. And I'm just gonna go in and block out this entire dark area, working quickly because, oops, I went on the white a little bit. There we go. Working quickly so that it doesn't dry on me and create a hard edge. And working a little bit more loosely, more playfully, one could say. In this one, I'm just trying to capture a bit more of the essence of the feather without intentionally trying to put in all of that detail that I did in the previous one. So blocking out the general form. Let's see, let's get a blue now. So same thing. Ultramarine, we'll keep it light. I like to mix in some of the other colors that I was working with. If they're similar enough, I'll get something, especially for these first layers, that's light, and it doesn't really matter if it's not quite the color you're going for, because as long as it's close, you can build up in the subsequent layers. We're gonna keep that mid-rib isolated and white this time. And just block in the next section. A little bit more formulaic doing it this way. But again, I'm just being playful, seeing what happens. Like that. And I might as well put in a little bit of the quill while I'm at this. There we go. All right. I'm gonna let that dry. Now that this is dried, we're gonna take a more bold approach than in the first feather painting, and just apply the next blob of color, building up layers a little bit more intensely than before. So we're gonna mix up a black again. Got my blue, ultramarine, French ultramarine, and burnt sienna. How's that look? Let's do a test swatch. Looks pretty good. I'm gonna build it up just a bit more in intensity though, because it looks pretty light, so more blue, more pigment to water ratio to get more intensity. All right, and we're gonna come in and boldly add this watercolor in to these dark areas, but be a bit more playful again. Playful is the word I keep coming back to with this method and how we're choosing to apply this. It's a little bit more graphic, a little bit more stylistic in some ways, but I think it works pretty well, and I really like the effect that it has. Way more feather-like in some ways, but definitely playful. And for this, I'm going to switch also to my small brush so that I can get a little bit more fine-tuning, a little more detail with some of these lines. Like that. And I'm focusing in once again on areas of imperfection, trying to capitalize on those. But letting it be loose as well. All right. Let's also do the other side over here in blue. I'm gonna go bold with these bands once again. So let's grab one here. Another one there. And again, I'm working pretty quickly. I urge you to take your time, be patient. You don't want to rush the watercolor if you can. But I'm going a little faster just for the sake of the video. So I've added those bands in. I'm also now going to take my small brush and just add a bit more finesse to these, a little bit more definition. Clean them up a bit. And then dilute a little bit and take advantage of this area that's a bit more diffused. We lose some of this band in the feather. We can take advantage of that and intentionally lose some of the definition here by fading it, fuzzing that edge a little bit. And I'll do the rest in it once this is dried. So we'll let that dry. Great, now that this is dried, we'll move on to finishing up. So I'm gonna grab some of my blue again. I'm gonna try to do the left side of the feather now and approach it a bit more directly than I was doing the other time where we were doing slow glazes of building up color. So I'm going to mix up again Cerulean Blue and French Ultramarine to try to approximate the vivid blue that we're seeing on the left of the feather. And let's see, here's a test. Let's do a little more cerulean. seems pretty good. And I'm gonna go ahead and grab a bunch of that and just start to add it in. This time I'm just painting it in where it goes, sort of blobbing it up rather than covering the entire feather with it. And I'm gonna also put some on this side because we do have some blue crossover on this side. Make sure my intensity is roughly the same wherever I want it to be. And then down here, I'm gonna fade it out just a little bit because this part down here isn't as vivid blue. So I'll dilute it just a bit, maybe too much. Dry my brush up, there we go. All right, while that's settling, make sure that looks good. Let's do this side over here. So I'm thinking we need a little bit more of a warm color, like a brown. This area, this gray is a little too blue, a little too cool. So we'll add some burnt sienna, maybe some raw umber as well. And I'm gonna work over here this time. Some raw umber. And then, of course, the French Ultramarine just to counterbalance a bit, but we'll keep it on the warmer side, so make sure we have plenty of that raw umber and burnt sienna. Let's test that. I think it could go a little more sienna still. A little more. That looks good. And it's a little too intense, so I'm going to dilute it, but the color itself is getting there. There we go. That looks a little better. So dry off my brush a little bit, and we'll start to do some blob application. Just drop it in roughly in the direction that the feather is going. So and I like to keep some of the underlying color exposed. It gives it a nice bit of color diversity that draws interest to the eye. Cool. Okay. I'm going to use that same color on the right side, especially towards the bottom, and then maybe up along the midrib a little bit. And a little bit at the top too. All right, that's looking pretty good. Let's do a little bit of blue, very light, just for these whites at the top again. White, accentuate the midrib. A little bit of feather texture. Some more of these downy feathers down here. And then I think we're pretty close to done. I'm going to add another layer of brown over here, and I think I want to diffuse these bands a little bit because they still seem pretty stark, but I think we can use some violet like we did in this feather just to add a little bit more color and interest. So I'm going to get the Alizarin Crimson again. I'll bring back my mixing container. So here we go, mixing that with some Ultramarine to get a nice rich violet. And I'll dilute that so it's not quite so vivid. Quick test. And then make sure this is dry, see where I want to apply it. It's about capturing that kind of iridescent blue, the iridescent hue that we have. I think I'll do a couple more things here. I said we'd get that brown, so I'm going to mix up that sienna again, get a little more in there. And then do this as my final layering and give it a lot of texture just for that graphic effect. Add some at the bottom once again. And maybe some at the top. Maybe a little too much at the top. I'm going to remove some with a drier brush. Kind of fuzz that out just a little bit so it's not so stark. And I think that looks pretty good for now. Last thing is the quill in the middle. Oh, I said I was gonna fuzz out these bands a little bit, and I can do that just by using a damp brush like this and touching up the edge. It'll kind of smooth it over a bit so it's not quite so stark. It looks a little too artificial being that stark, but I like the intensity of the bands. They're really dark. Great. And now let's do that quill in the middle. So I need a rich black for that. I'd mixed one previously, so I'm going to re-wet this. That's partly why I like to save my paints that are all mixed up. I put all that work into mixing them up. I might as well keep them and use them again. Let's test that. That looks good. I'm going to switch to my tiny brush for this. Get plenty of color. And then figure out where the black roughly starts. It looks like around here. Being careful not to bleed over into the areas that are still wet. Here's where I get to be really delicate again, and where patience will pay off. Again, you know, I could spend more time on this just in terms of taking my time. Oops. But I want to rush through just a little bit so that it doesn't take too long for you watching. Let's call that part done. A little more definition here, and I think the feather body is done. One final thing that I forgot to mention that I think looks nice on feathers is to do a little bit of lifting or pulling. So this works well when the area is damp, but you can also do it when it's dry. You just got to be a little more persistent and be really careful not to insert too much water, as it looks like I'm doing. But basically I'm just pulling out some of the color that was in the paper previously and helping to establish a bit more of that directional texture. Those barbs that are going out splayed to either direction. And I'm just choosing a couple spots, especially where it's darkest, to create this effect. I gotta be a little persistent, and I'm drying my brush off between passes so that I can remove the color. But see how it just adds a little bit more. It makes it a little bit lighter. And it sometimes works better with a bit of a stiffer brush. Depends on how impregnated the pigment is in the paper, and that will vary based on what pigment you're using. But it looks like I can do a little bit here, get a little bit of that effect, which is nice. All right, so 2 approaches. You can see that they're both different. They have similar end results, but different feels to them. Here's a couple other little studies of the same feathers that I did earlier. This one I added a cast shadow, and that's just a quick wash of a light gray or pale blue, just to give it that 3D effect. But I hope you guys get a chance to try these at home. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me in this watercolored feathers demonstration. I hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to check out my future videos for other watercolors inspired by Tony Foster's Exploring Beauty journey. I'll see you then.